That night they mocked her, unaware their lives were about to change. They taunted her as mute for her cold silence, calling her Iron Doll. But when the colonel shouted her name before the entire unit, nothing would ever be the same. Lucia Montenegro hadn't spoken at all during her morning briefing. When Lieutenant Banks interrupted her presentation and said, "Maybe you should focus on filing documents instead of trying to figure out war strategy," she had simply stood there in silence. The other officers had chuckled, their phones carefully recording. No one had noticed the cold calculation in Lucia's eyes, or the truth hidden under the thin metal chain around her neck, dog tags with a code name most had never heard. "Some people have to know their place," Banks called to the room. But she didn't yet know she had the wrong soldier. The other soldiers at Camp Resolute called Lucia the Iron Doll. This nickname, whispered behind her back, had started as mockery, but had gradually transformed into a strange kind of respect. They said she never spoke, never smiled, never showed weakness. She worked in the Intelligence Analysis Division, a job most considered desk work. Yet the truth was, she made tactical assessments that affected operations across 3 continents. She analyzed threat patterns, decoded intercepted communications. What no one knew was this. Lucia had worked for 6 years as a covert operative in the Army's Intelligence Support Unit. In this officially denied unit, she had infiltrated terrorist cells in war zones, gathered intelligence from enemy territories, and survived situations that would have broken most soldiers. Her code name was Ghost, a name earned through her ability to move unseen, strike without warning, and vanish. The explosion that ended her career had occurred during an extraction operation. While her teammates fought their way to the extraction point, Lucia had stayed behind to ensure the secure destruction of classified documents. The bomb that destroyed half the building had left more than just physical scars. It had taken the career she'd built and the identity she'd earned. The medical discharge had been processed quietly, her service records scrubbed of all references to her classified work. To the world, she was just an intelligence analyst injured in a routine convoy attack. Lieutenant Trevor Banks had been her primary antagonist since Lucia's arrival at Camp Resolute. An officer who had risen through the right connections rather than demonstrating competence, Banks represented everything Lucia despised about military politics. "I don't know what strings you pulled to get this assignment," he'd said, "but don't expect special treatment. This unit operates on merit, not diversity quotas." Since then, Banks had systematically undermined Lucia's work. He would question her analyses in front of junior officers, assign her trivial tasks that wasted her expertise, and exclude her from planning meetings where her contribution would be valuable. 3 weeks ago, Lucia had discovered a pattern indicating an impending attack on a base. Her analysis showed that the enemy had detailed knowledge of the base's defensive positions and patrol schedules. When she presented her findings to the Intelligence Assessment Board, Banks had immediately objected. "This is speculative analysis at best," he'd said. "We can't base operational decisions on hunches." While the warning was buried in committee reviews, the attack date was approaching.
Lucia helplessly watched as her concerns were dismissed. The attack occurred exactly as she had predicted. 12 soldiers were wounded, 2 severely. The coordinated assault had exploited every vulnerability Lucia had identified. Afterward, Banks managed to deflect responsibility, claiming Lucia's analysis had been incomplete. But the real shock came 3 days later.
When the mission orders for Operation Sandstone arrived, the file in Lucia's hands pointed to an even greater danger. The Special Forces team was being sent into a region where the enemy knew their every move. She prepared a comprehensive threat assessment. The intelligence painted a disturbing picture of an enemy that had learned their tactics and was prepared to exploit predictable behavioral patterns. "Same type of alarmist speculation," Banks cut her off, barely glancing at the report. "We can't postpone missions because of theoretical concerns." Colonel Patricia Hawthorne examined Lucia's report more carefully. "These patterns are concerning. For the enemy to know our operational procedures this well suggests either excellent intelligence gathering or an inside information leak." The debate lasted an hour, with Banks systematically undermining each of Lucia's concerns. The operation was approved, Lucia's warnings dismissed. The operation, beginning at 0300, went smoothly for the first hour. Then the trap was sprung. The enemy had prepared a sophisticated ambush that exploited every aspect of the mission profile. Extraction helicopters were targeted with missiles. Coordinated fire came from concealed positions specifically prepared to cut off the team's expected approach routes. Most damaging of all, the enemy knew the team's communication protocols and tactical procedures in detail. In the operations center, the scope of the intelligence failure became clear within minutes. Banks's confident assertions about manageable threat levels were being catastrophically disproven in real time. "Alternative extraction can be made from grid 247351, Lucia said, speaking for the first time, "outside the enemy's prepared ambush zone, but the team will need to move 3 kilometers through enemy territory." Banks immediately objected. "That route will take them through a known enemy patrol area. It's suicide." "The alternative is leaving them in a prepared kill zone," Lucia replied. Colonel Hawthorne made the decision. "Authorize the alternative extraction. Get helicopters airborne immediately." The next 2 hours were a nightmare of the surrounded team fighting their way through enemy territory toward the alternative extraction point. 2 team members died in the initial ambush. 3 more were wounded in subsequent firefights. But the last-minute change in extraction plans prevented a complete catastrophe. When the survivors returned to base, the full extent of the intelligence failure became clear. The enemy had detailed knowledge of the mission's timing, insertion routes, target location, and extraction procedures. The operation had been compromised from the start. Colonel Hawthorne immediately launched an investigation into the intelligence failure and the decision-making process that led to the dangerous mission's approval. Banks tried to deflect responsibility. "We can't halt every mission because of theoretical concerns," he defended himself. "Military operations inherently involve risk." But the investigation quickly revealed a pattern of overlooked warnings and dismissed intelligence assessments. Banks's systematic undermining of Lucia's work was documented by other officers. The most damning evidence came from the intelligence reports themselves. Lucia's assessments had been remarkably accurate, predicting not just the likelihood of enemy resistance, but the specific tactics and preparations that nearly destroyed the Special Forces team. As the investigation progressed, other examples of Banks's poor judgment emerged.
Officers who had previously remained silent began sharing their own experiences of having concerns dismissed or expertise questioned. The final report was devastating in its conclusions. The investigation found that major banks had systematically ignored credible intelligence warnings, failed to properly assess threat evaluations, and allowed personal prejudices to influence professional decision-making. But the real reckoning came during the formal hearing that followed the investigation. Lucia was called to testify about her analyses and the circumstances surrounding their dismissal. For the first time since arriving at Camp Resolute, she spoke openly about her professional background and the basis for her assessments. "I served 6 years in the intelligence support unit," she said, her voice steady and clear. "During that time, I conducted 40 intelligence operations in enemy-controlled territories, 12 deep cover assignments. My analytical methods are based on direct operational experience, not theoretical speculation." The hearing room fell silent as the impact of her words was understood. The quiet analyst, who had been dismissed as inexperienced, had emerged as one of the military's most senior intelligence professionals. Banks's face went pale. He hadn't just rejected a competent analyst, he had dismissed warnings from one of the military world's most experienced intelligence professionals. "Major Banks," said the investigating officer, "did you make any effort to verify the analyst's professional background before consistently rejecting her assessments?" The information was classified," Banks stammered. "I based my evaluations on her performance in her current assignment." "A performance that included accurate predictions, foresight about enemy tactics, and sensitive threat assessments that would have prevented American casualties if heeded?" Banks had no answer. His career was effectively over, destroyed by the same prejudices that had initially led him to dismiss Lucia's expertise.
The months following the Operation Sandstone investigation brought significant changes to Camp Resolute. Banks was quietly transferred to a desk job at the Pentagon, his career effectively ended by the scandal. For Lucia, vindication was satisfying but incomplete. The official recognition of her professional competence had cost 2 soldiers their lives and many others their careers. Colonel Hawthorne offered her a promotion and transfer to a prestigious intelligence position. The assignment would represent a significant career advancement and a return to the high-level analytical work that had defined her previous service. "You've more than proven your abilities," the colonel said in their private meeting. "This position would put you at the center of strategic intelligence operations." Lucia considered the offer carefully, but she realized her priorities had changed during her experience at Camp Resolute. "I appreciate the offer, Colonel," she said finally, "but I think my skills would be better used in a training and development role. There are other analysts who need mentoring, and there are systemic problems with how intelligence is evaluated and acted upon." The colonel assigned her to head the new Intelligence Analysis Training Program. The position involved curriculum development, training junior analysts, and working with other bases to improve intelligence procedures. Her first major initiative was establishing a mentorship program that paired experienced analysts with newcomers. The program emphasized the importance of comprehensive analysis, professional presentation, and the courage to maintain professional standards even when facing pressure from senior officers. The program's success was measured not just in improved intelligence analysis, but in the confidence of participating analysts. Junior personnel who had previously hesitated to question senior officers' assumptions learned to present their findings with professional authority. One of Lucia's most important contributions was developing a standardized intelligence review process that required detailed documentation of decision-making rationale.
The new procedures made it much more difficult for senior officers to reject intelligence assessments based on personal prejudices or political considerations. 6 months later, the system was tested during a major operation. When an analyst identified potential threats for a planned mission, the review process required detailed evaluation of the warnings rather than summary rejection. Changes made to the operation prevented what intelligence later confirmed was a significant ambush. The success of the Camp Resolute program led to its adoption at other facilities. Lucia's assignments as an implementation consultant increased. Her reputation within the intelligence community transformed from rejected analyst to respected expert in intelligence procedures and training. At the annual Intelligence Excellence Conference, she took the podium as the keynote speaker. In the audience were many officers who had worked with her throughout her career. Intelligence work, she began, is fundamentally about seeing clearly through a cloud of assumptions and prejudices. The greatest threat to accurate analysis isn't enemy deception, it's our own biases and systems that allow those biases to override professional expertise. Among the listeners, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen listened with pride. She too had been promoted to manage an intelligence training program at another base. After the conference, a young captain who had recently completed one of Lucia's training program approached her. "Commander," he said, "I wanted to thank you for the work you're doing. Your training program gave me the tools and confidence to present my assessments effectively. Last month, I identified a potential threat that might have been dismissed under the old system, but the new review procedures ensured it was properly evaluated." "What was the outcome?" Lucia asked. "The operation was modified according to my recommendations and was successful without casualties. The enemy had prepared an ambush exactly where I predicted." The conversation was validation of everything Lucia had tried to accomplish. The systems she had developed weren't just theoretical improvements, they were practical tools that saved lives and prevented the intelligence failures that had characterized her early Camp Resolute experience. Her career transformation had been gradual and often difficult, but it had ultimately led to something more valuable than personal vindication. She had helped create a professional environment where competence was valued over compliance, where comprehensive analysis was prioritized over convenient conclusions, and where the quiet voices of experienced professionals were heard and respected. She still wore those old dog tags beneath her uniform. They bore not just her name and service number, but the code name that had defined her covert operations career, Ghost. The name had taken on new meaning in her current role. She had become a different kind of ghost, one who rarely appeared in the public eye while working to create systematic changes. The Iron Doll had evolved from a nickname born of prejudice and misunderstanding. It had become a symbol of professional excellence and the quiet power that transforms systems from within. There are those who mistake silence for weakness, humility for inadequacy. But Lucia's story shows that true strength often lies in the quiet persistence of those who work to change systems through careful analysis. The most important victories are often won not by those who win conflicts, but by those who prevent them. Sometimes the most valuable team members are those who work like ghosts, drawing no attention to themselves while delivering consistent results, visible only in the excellence of their work.
5 years after the Operation Sandstone investigation, Lucia's influence had spread far beyond the walls of Camp Resolute. Her intelligence training methodologies had been adopted by 17 military installations across 4 continents. The Montenegro Protocol, as it came to be known, had become the gold standard for intelligence assessment procedures. The protocol's most revolutionary aspect wasn't just its systematic approach to threat evaluation, but its emphasis on psychological safety for analysts. Junior personnel were encouraged to challenge assumptions, ask difficult questions, and present dissenting views without fear of career repercussions. This cultural shift had prevented dozens of intelligence failures that might have cost countless lives. At the Pentagon, a new generation of intelligence officers carried forward the lessons learned from that dark period at Camp Resolute. Colonel Sarah Chen, now running the Strategic Intelligence Development Center, often referenced the Iron Doll incident in her lectures to new recruits. Remember, she would tell them, the most dangerous enemy isn't the one you can see. It's the prejudice that blinds you to the expertise sitting right next to you. The story had become legendary within military intelligence circles, often told as a cautionary tale about the consequences of dismissing unconventional voices. But for those who lived through it, the lesson ran deeper. It was about the quiet courage required to speak truth to power, and the patient persistence needed to change systems from within. Trevor Banks, the former lieutenant whose prejudice had nearly caused a catastrophe, had quietly retired from military service. His last years in the Pentagon had been spent in increasingly marginal roles, his career effectively ended by his own biases. He now worked as a security consultant for a private firm, his military experience reduced to a footnote in his biography. In rare moments of honesty, Banks would admit that his treatment of Lucia Montenegro had been his greatest professional failure. Not because it ended his career, but because it had shown him the worst version of himself, a man who had let assumptions override evidence, who had confused confidence with competence. Meanwhile, Lucia had continued to evolve in her role. Her latest initiative was developing cross-cultural intelligence training programs, recognizing that modern conflicts required understanding not just enemy tactics, but the cultural contexts that shaped them. Her own multicultural background, Montenegro by name, American by service, and international by experience, made her uniquely qualified for this work. The program paired military analysts with cultural anthropologists, linguists, and regional specialists. It was revolutionary in its approach, breaking down the traditional silos that had limited intelligence effectiveness for decades. "We're not just analyzing data," Lucia explained to a group of visiting generals. "We're trying to understand the human stories behind the intelligence. Every intercept, every satellite image, every report represents real people making real decisions based on their own cultural logic. If we can't understand that logic, we can't predict their actions." This human-centered approach to intelligence had already yielded remarkable results. In 3 separate operations, cultural insights had revealed enemy plans that traditional analysis had missed. The success rate of operations utilizing the new methodology was 40% higher than those using conventional approaches. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. Lucia had found something she hadn't expected when she first arrived at Camp Resolute, a sense of purpose that went beyond individual achievement. She was building something that would outlast her own career, creating systems that would protect soldiers she would never meet. Her office wall displayed a collection of letters from military personnel around the world. Each one told a story of how the Montenegro Protocol had made a difference, a threat identified, an ambush avoided, lives saved. These weren't abstract statistics, they were real people who had gone home safely to their families. One letter from a young sergeant in Afghanistan particularly moved her. "Commander Montenegro, I wanted you to know that your training saved my squad last month. We were planning a routine patrol when our analyst, a private who had just completed your program, flagged an unusual pattern in local communications. Under the old system, her concerns might have been dismissed because of her rank. But because of your protocols, her analysis was properly evaluated. We discovered the enemy had prepared a complex IED network along our planned route. By taking an alternate path, we avoided what would have been a devastating ambush. 8 soldiers went home safe that day because someone listened to a private's concern. Thank you for teaching us that expertise has no rank. These stories reminded Lucia why she had chosen teaching over returning to active intelligence work. Every analyst she trained has the potential to save lives, to prevent the kind of tragedy that had marked her early days at Camp Resolute. Her influence extended beyond military circles. Universities began incorporating her methodologies into their intelligence studies programs. Think tanks quoted her papers on organizational bias in threat assessment. She had become, without seeking it, one of the most influential voices in modern intelligence theory. The irony wasn't lost on her. The woman who had once been dismissed as just a desk analyst was now shaping how intelligence work was conducted across the Western world. The Iron Doll had become the voice of an entire generation of intelligence professionals. But perhaps the most significant change was in Lucia herself. The bitter, isolated analyst who had arrived at Camp Resolute had evolved into someone who understood the power of mentorship, collaboration, and systemic change. She had learned that true strength wasn't in working alone. It was in building systems that elevate everyone. Her latest project was establishing the Montenegro Institute for Intelligence Excellence, a research center dedicated to studying and preventing intelligence failures. The institute would partner with military organizations, academic institutions, and even former adversaries to develop better methods for gathering, analyzing, and acting on intelligence. "We're not just trying to win the next conflict," she explained to the Institute's board of directors. "We're trying to understand conflicts well enough to prevent them. The best intelligence victory is the war that never happens." The Institute's first major study examined historical intelligence failures, from Pearl Harbor to 9/11 to the weapons of mass destruction assessments that preceded the Iraq War. The common thread in each case wasn't lack of information. It was the failure to properly evaluate and act on information that was available. In every case, the study concluded, the intelligence community had pieces of the puzzle. The failure was in assembling those pieces, often because organizational biases, political pressures, or personal prejudices prevented proper analysis. The study's recommendations had already influenced policy at the highest levels. New procedures required devil's advocate positions in all major intelligence assessments. Red team exercises regularly challenged conventional wisdom. And most importantly, mechanisms were put in place to ensure that dissenting voices, regardless of their source, would be heard and evaluated. As Lucia reflected on her journey from dismissed analyst to influential reformer, she realized that her story wasn't unique. Throughout history, progress had often come from those who had been overlooked, dismissed, or marginalized. The key was creating systems that could recognize and amplify those voices before tragedy struck. The dog tags she still wore beneath her uniform had become something more than personal mementos. They were reminders of the different phases of her career. The ghost who had worked in shadows, the iron doll who had endured dismissal and prejudice, and now the teacher who was helping to ensure that others wouldn't have to endure the same struggles. Her legacy wouldn't be found in any single operation or analysis. It would be in the countless small moments when a young analyst found the courage to challenge a superior's assumptions, when a systematic review process caught a critical flaw, when cultural understanding prevented a tragic miscalculation. The ripple effects of her work would continue long after her retirement. Students trained in her methods would train others. Systems she had helped design would evolve and improve.
The cultural changes she had advocated would become so embedded in military intelligence that future generations would hardly remember a time when things were different. But for now, Lucia Montenegro continued her work. One training session at a time, one mentorship at a time, one systematic improvement at a time.